Welcome, everyone. My name is Mitch Kowalski, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with Simon Tupman and talking about his new book, The Heart of Practice. Simon, thanks for spending a few minutes with us today.
Great pleasure. Nice to talk with you.
Yeah. So, Simon, it's been about a quarter century since your last book, Why Lawyers Should Eat Bananas, which focused on individual attributes of lawyers and how they can make the most out of their practice. And now you switch gears into leadership. And, particularly poignant, I think, in these very uncertain times when we're starting to see law firm mergers across the world and everybody uncertain about what's going to happen with the economics of their law firm. And I'm wondering if you could just take us through your four main principles of leadership and also talk a little bit more why you switch gears into leadership as opposed to individual lawyers.
Sure. Well, in the last 25 years, I've been working with a variety of legal professionals around the world from my base down here in Australasia. And I guess I had a professional frustration. That was that I kept running into brick walls quite often with firms who'd say, we've got good management, we're making money, but sometimes the behaviors that took place or were demonstrated at senior levels in some of these firms were not what I'd call synonymous with leadership necessarily. And to my mind, I think firms are missing out on a great opportunity to accelerate the interests of their firm by not really focusing on this aspect of leadership. So I wanted to tackle that in my book. And in doing so, I wanted to address perhaps some entrenched beliefs that I think hold firms back. For example, the idea that, being a partner is synonymous with being a leader. It's not. And as I'm sure you'd recognize, there are people who are partners who, by virtue of their ability to generate high fees or because of their expertise, but not necessarily because of any leadership attributes. And sometimes those people behave in such a way as to actually disengage people, turn them off and have them heading for the door and looking for a job elsewhere. So that was just one of the beliefs I think that hold firms back. So I wanted to really sort of dissect this issue of leadership because the word itself means different things to different people, as I'm sure you recognize. In fact, as I was writing this book, I saw that there were something like over 15,000 books in print at the moment with the title leadership in it. So I thought, well, I really wanted to try and distill and demystify the concept of leadership for legal professionals, not just lawyers, but also executives who are working in law firms to advance the interests of the business. And I broke it down into four areas: self-leadership, people leadership, business leadership, and community leadership. And in regards to those four areas, I attach a principle. It's not rocket science. People will nod at this and say, well, okay, tell me something new. So it's not particularly revelatory in terms of what I'm suggesting. But I think the difficulty is in applying in practice those principles. And sometimes it's a bit like the Ten Commandments. We know them to be right, but sometimes we find them difficult to put into practice. But I'll tell you briefly what those four principles are. In terms of self-leadership, firstly, I'm suggesting that before you lead others, you need to learn to lead yourself. Okay, so that requires, I think, people to take a good look at themselves in the mirror and say, what drives me to do what I'm doing every day, and am I basically setting a good example to other people in terms of how I conduct myself? And I think there's an element here of, coming to terms with your true self. And I think there are periods in our lives where, in the early stages of our career, we're very focused on acquisition, winning money, status, job security, and all the rest of it. But I think that the older we become and the more mature and reflective we become, we move on to this second phase in our life where it's less focused on acquisition and more on contribution. So when we're in that phase, then I think leadership really starts to kick in, and we start taking an interest in other people around us, not just our own selves, as it were. So that's the first one. The second one, talking about leading people, is basically to stop treating them as human resources, as if they're people we can just fire because we're not making enough money, but understand that, they are humans, they are emotion, they're doing their best. And I think there's much to be gained by looking at how we actually bring the best out of our people, how we give them inspiration, how we give them a sense of purpose and belonging, and remind them about the the genuine goodness of being a lawyer and what it does to our society. So I think that's the second aspect. And in my experience, there are a lot of legal professionals out there who find leading people quite difficult. They like being lawyers, but they find leading teams and leading people to be quite difficult. The third area is running your firm as a business entity. That's the third principle. And this may sound obvious, but you will appreciate this too, that the traditional partnership model of old has not necessarily been conducive with slick decision making, if I can put it that way. And what I'm finding is, particularly in the smaller to mid-sized firms, who are, as you'd suggested earlier, are looking to grow either perhaps by way of merger, which has its pitfalls, or they really need to hone in and say, how do we run our firm more as a business entity? And that means, I guess, delineating the important powers of any business, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. The problem with a partnership is that you wear all three hats sometimes in the same meeting, and so therefore there's an inherent conflict of interest. So I'm just basically suggesting to particularly owners of law firms that they're very clear about delineating responsibility between those who may be owners of the business, so i.e. the shareholders, and those who have responsibility for advancing the business interests, i.e. the management and the executive suite. And the fourth principle that I'm talking about relating to community is basically to help solve some of the world's problems. What I mean by that is we're not talking just pro bono and a bit of raising money for charity, but also perhaps taking a look at some of the policies that drive the firm's strategies. And are they in line with, say, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? And indeed, I'm coming across firms now that are actually taking a closer look at things like cutting back carbon emissions, diversity, inclusion, equality, access to justice, some of those things. So those are the four principles in a nutshell, and that's effectively why I wrote this book, to help improve the lot of legal professionals so that their firms run more smoothly and that team are more engaged, and ultimately I think they're capable of being more successful in the long term, and I think giving clients a better deal and better value as well.
Right. Well, that's brilliant. That really puts it in a nutshell. And I think it's something, as you pointed out, is it sounds really simple, but actually focusing on it and being disciplined about it is a whole other story. Now, the second half of the book is a series of interviews. So for the listeners out there and the viewers out there, Simon writes in a very readable, easy to understand way that is not often found in legal texts. And so the readability is high, but he also puts in these a score of interviews at the end where he's gone out and spoken to actual people who are walking the talk, as you suggested, and you've covered the whole world pretty much. I mean, you've got people from all over the world, so it's not set only in New Zealand. It's not set only in Australia. It covers the gamut. And I'm just wondering, is there someone in some of those interviews that you particularly stood out that you could just share with us briefly?
Yes, I mean, they were all great interviews, and there are 10 of them in the book. And the reason I put them there was to effectively embroider the principles that appeared in the first half of the book. In other words, don't just take my word for it, but there are people out here actually practicing these principles on a daily basis. There were several interviews, couple of interviews, 2 or 3 interviews actually, I think, from the United Kingdom, which is always interesting because they've probably liberalised their profession ahead of say Australasia or certainly New Zealand. So I was particularly taken with the interview with Robert Camp, who had been the managing partner of West Country firm Stephen Scone. When he took over as managing partner, I think he described it as being a sort of a comfortable, quite conservative firm that was sort of fair to middling in terms of its performance. But he basically took the firm by the scruff of the neck and certainly ran it, I think, in a far more effective way, and certainly enable the firm to grow, and through innovation, through getting external opinion advice from non-executive directors, and introducing an employee ownership scheme, which they call Sconership, which was very innovative in Britain, and I think several firms have now tried to emulate. So for me, that's really sort of captured the challenge of the day, particularly for lots of firms here in New Zealand, where employee ownership is still not permitted, although that's under regulatory review right now. So I was very taken with that. And then, from New Zealand, Helen Mackay's interview, she's the principal of Juno Law, also really attracted my interest. She'd come into starting her own firm from being in-house counsel. And I just think her authenticity and her individual leadership and the example she sets for others, I think was quite inspirational. So certainly the feedback I've had so far from people who've been reading the book is that they really genuinely enjoy tapping into the hearts and minds of those people who are actually doing it on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to hear it from the practical aspects as opposed to the theoretical, and you're melding it together. I think it just makes it an even more compelling read for those of us out there. So how do we get the book, Simon?
If you want it as a Kindle version, you can go on to Amazon and download the Kindle version. If you want the hard copy, like the one I've got behind me on my right shoulder, here it is. It's got quite big font, and it's just under 200 pages long. In fact, it's 204, I think. And there's a few pictures in there too. So it's about a 2.5 hour read, I think, from cover to cover. You can get that off my website, simontupman.com, and we'll get it in the mail to you, depending where you are in the world. It seems to be, freight is a bit slow at the moment, but they'll get there. Yeah.
Not only is it readable, but the dipping in and out. So I like books that you can dip in and out. You can just pick certain segments and focus on that, and it's very easy to do. So Simon, thank you so much for today, and ladies and gentlemen, I hope that was helpful for you and you'll pick up The Heart of Practice.